Hey, good Wednesday morning, everybody. BAM weather meteorologist Brett Waltz here, giving you a winter weather Wednesday forecast update, something we will continue to be doing every Wednesday, talking about the latest indications we are seeing with the upcoming winter pattern. Last week, we talked about La Nina and the volatility of La Nina years over the past 25 to 30 plus years, and then some of the other pattern drivers that could come into play to influence the La Nina forcing. Today, we are going to look specifically at December, because while there's a lot of variability, a lot of volatility with La Nina years throughout winter as a whole, December, there tends to be a little bit less. There's a little bit more consistency in what La Nina years do in December. Still some variability, and we'll talk about that and what to look for to determine whether we're going to lean colder or warmer. But I want to look at the picture that a weak La Nina typically brings for December. Again, variability beyond that, but for December, there's a little bit more of a stronger indication. That's what we're going to chat about as we get into this video. Starting out here with the current sea surface temperature observations, you can see that the observations in the ENSO 3.4 region, which is kind of the standard region we look for a La Nina versus an El Nino, sitting right at that weak La Nina marker over the past month or so, maybe declining slightly over the past 15 to 20 days. Would expect it to continue to decline a little bit, but I don't expect it to lower down much. Very confident that we are going to be in this weak La Nina territory, at least to start out winter. Maybe it warms up a little bit at the end. We probably average out at the end of the day for winter, somewhere between cool, neutral, and a weak La Nina. I think that the background state is feeling very much like a La Nina, regardless of the ocean temperatures. Taking a look here at the latest forecast that came out from the CPC IRI, this multi-model ensemble, and you can see a pretty good agreement here among all of these models that we are going to be right around that weak La Nina mark as we work through November, December, January, February, before warming up closer to neutral, maybe even above normal, into that warm neutral territory as we work into the spring and next summer. And this ultimately, guys, I think, especially for the first part of winter, going to be really, really important. We're already seeing signals that this is having an influence on our pattern as we go into November. And so, again, I just want to be sure to emphasize that while La Ninas have a ton of variability for the winter as a whole, especially January, February, December is the one month where we can get a little bit more insight into recent history and a little bit more confidence into what's going to happen based off the La Nina state. In terms of winter, I do want to mention here, guys, if you have not yet signed up for our 25-26 Winter Outlook webinar, to go ahead and do that. It's completely free, 11 a.m. on Wednesday, November 5th, bamwx.com/webinar. It's where we will break down all of the details, all of the pattern drivers, and ultimately our winter outlook in that webinar. We'll have an update on South America, energy demand, among other things, snowfall potential in that webinar, so be sure to go sign up for that. Getting into today's analysis, I want to start here. These are weak La Nina years for November, and a couple of key things that I am keeping an eye on that I am seeing pop up right now, one of which is what we call a positive P&A, ridge of high pressure and warmth here in the western part of the country. The second of which is higher pressure, warmer air here over Greenland and the Hudson Bay. This traditionally favors cooler air in the eastern part of the country. If you've been watching some of our forecast videos, that's exactly what we've been talking about to close October and to start out November. And so the pattern ahead is resembling these weak La Nina years as we go into November. And just for more evidence of that, if we take a look at the European model, European weekly, throughout the month of November, it matches up nearly identically with this composite. And so very much ahead, looking like the weak La Nina years as we go into the month of November. And so naturally that piqued my interest, and let's look at what those roll into for December. If we take a look at the upper level pattern for these same years in December, you'll notice a couple of things. Number one, a big shift in the North Pacific. And this is really key to truly get Arctic air blast. We have to see this North Pacific ridge, what we call a negative EPO, develop, and you can see these analogs strongly support that. But the other thing that intrigues me about this is the high latitude blocking. The warmth and the higher pressure that's showing up on these analogs here over the Arctic and especially over Greenland. If you recall last week, especially the back half of winter, there is a stronger signal for less blocking over Greenland. And a little bit, as a result, warmer temperatures across the southern tier of the U.S. and some uncertainty on the east coast. However, for December, these analogs in particular would indicate more of a negative NAO. That would open the door for shots of colder air across the northern and the eastern United States. The core of your warmth would, as a result, be shunted down further to the south into the west. And so this negative NAO signal is one that I'm watching carefully because I think that's the difference for the East Coast between a cold and snowy December and one that favors more of the Midwest, northern plains for more bitter cold and big snow shots. Taking a look at the European seasonal model, this is its forecast for December, it actually looks pretty similar to these same analogs. You can see it's got your polar vortex, your tropospheric polar vortex, your cold air source, or Hudson Bay vortex, whatever you want to call it here, over the Hudson Bay, which is a supply of cold air into the U.S., but it also has this negative EPO blocking here. It's got high latitude blocking over Greenland and over the Arctic. This, regardless of its signal down here across the southern U.S., would open the door for shots of cold air across the northern and the eastern part of the country into the month of December. Taking a look at what these years look like at the surface, you can see that it really suppresses that southern ridge. Instead of allowing warmth to come up the east coast like this, like if we were to not have that blocking signal in Greenland, it allows for the colder air to bleed across the northern tier of the U.S. You can see it's pretty widespread here in terms of this colder air. It's also above normal for both the 10-year and the 30-year normal. Another big factor that I think can play a major role in the intensity of the signal as we get into December is our global wind state. And so taking this another step further, the global wind state, if you're not familiar with it, gives an idea of what the background, what the atmosphere is truly feeling. We looked at the sea surface temperatures, that's obviously very important, but the background of the atmosphere is also very important. The weaker our global winds are, the more La Nina we are like. The more positive the global winds are, the more El Nino we are like. We have been consistently very negative, very weak with the global winds throughout, to be honest, the past 5 months or so. In fact, I think that even maybe goes back into early or late last winter. And so this has been a consistent signal, and if we look at the data ahead, we should see a rise, that is expected, but it's a negative signal all the way through November into the start of December, and if anything, the models have been verifying too high. The actual verifications have been lower than the model forecast over the past several months. That's important because if we look at Decembers that had weak global wind states since 1990, 98, 05, 07, 10, a couple of these are some pretty cold years in here, it tends to allow the colder air to spill more into the eastern half of the country. That's a colder risk to the forecast, and that's primarily because it has warmer air and more high latitude blocking over the North Atlantic. So that's another check in the colder risk column. And I will note, if we take a look at the latest CFS monthly, I'd argue it's trying to see this type of a signal. It's not perfect, but you can see how it has kind of the core of that polar vortex a little bit further to the east, which allows for that colder air to spread across the eastern part of the country rather than being trapped up here across the northern plains. One final thing that I want to note about this. If we just separate weak La Nina years between a positive global wind state and a negative global wind state, I think it tells the whole story. If the global winds are positive into December, 16, 21, 22, 24, the tendency as a whole is warmer. It's milder, especially across the southern tier of the U.S., colder air locked up to the north. You think about it this way, when the polar vortex is very strong, when the jet stream is very strong, it locks the cold air up to the north. If your global winds naturally are stronger, the tendency will be to lock the cold air up further to the north. On the flip side, if the global winds are negative, and this is probably a little extreme, but I just want to highlight the differences, the global winds are negative with a weak La Nina. These 4 years, 2000, 05, 08, 17, tend to run much colder than normal as a whole. And so, obviously, we've got a ways to go before we get to December, but the theme here would be if we can keep the global wind state negative, it's a colder December risk overall. Right now, I would be leaning in that direction. Maybe not quite this aggressive, but I do think the forecast risk is colder versus what our current outlook is. You can see we're certainly leaning more in that direction, but I think the risk right now is that we'd spread the below normal temperatures more so further to the south and to the east. Maybe bump up this warmth in the west just a touch. One big wild card that I will continue to keep an eye on for December is our tropical forcing in the MJO, because the European is doing something where it stalls this out kind of in MJO phases 5 and 6 in the Western Pacific. That is important because these phases are very warm into December. This is not our favorite idea right now, but a year like 2021 did do something like this where it stalled out November into December in phases 4, 5, 6, and 7 here, and ultimately that led to a very, very warm December. And so I want to keep an eye on the tropical forcing, because stalling out in the maritime or the Western Pacific would not be good for cold air in December. It would be a warmer forecast risk overall. So the other data, the American data, trying to move the MJO throughout November 6, 7, and into 8, that would open the door for the colder risk into the month of December. So this is the wild card. This is what we want to watch. Not my favorite idea right now. The EPS typically struggles with this and tries to stall things out here, when in reality, that's not the case. But that's what I want to at least keep an eye on for a warmer forecast risk into December. Guys, that's all I have for today's Outlook, taking a look at December. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great rest of your day.